why Armenia was important to the Romans. So, in between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire was the country of Armenia. And it was important to both sides because whoever controlled the kingdom of Armenia, whoever had the friendly king there, whoever had the alliance or the client state controlled it, would not have to station as many soldiers on that side of the border. So the times that the Romans controlled Armenia meant that they did not have to station as many soldiers on that side of the border. And when the Parthians and later the Sassanids controlled Armenia, same deal. They would not have to station as many soldiers or armies to deal with a threat or an invasion coming in from that country. And also, whoever controlled Armenia would be able to get support from Armenia's army. So when the Romans controlled Armenia, the Parthians would have to deal with an attack from the Armenian army. And when the Parthians or the Sassanids controlled Armenia, the Romans would have to deal with attacks from the Armenians on their side of the border. And ultimately, this went on for about 600 or 700 years, where Armenia went back and forth between the Parthians and Romans, and later the Sassanids and the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines. Now, in 53 BC, the first major clash between the Parthians and the Romans took place when the Roman general and politician Crassus, at the Battle of Carrhae, had invaded Parthia and tried to take over, but was defeated. Now, several years before Crassus, Pompey the Great, or Pompey Magnus, had gone east and had taken over Syria, made Judea a client kingdom, and had done other military campaigns in Anatolia and Turkey and in those areas, and in the Mediterranean and so forth. And those borders, those last major conquests by Pompey, the borders that he set up, for the most part, stayed the same for the next couple hundreds of years. Both sides, the Romans and the Parthians, fought each other until the 600s AD, when both the East Roman Empire and the Sassanids, or the Byzantine Empire, were eventually taken over by the Muslims. And Armenia played a key role in this, because whoever controlled that country as a client state would have a major military advantage in whatever conflict took place. And as the Roman and the Parthian conflict went on for so long, other countries also got involved. For example, instead of most of the activity taking place in the north, the Romans also got the Ghassanid kingdom involved as a client state, and for a while even the Palmyra was another client kingdom that the Romans had. The Roman Emperor Octavian had tried to take over other countries around the Arabian Peninsula, For example, in 26 BC, Octavian sent a Roman army down to Yemen, today's country of Yemen, and tried to take it over and make it a Roman client state, not just to get the resources that was there, but also to safeguard the Roman ships that traveled down from Egypt down the Red Sea and then out through the Arabian Sea on their way to India to engage in trade and commerce there. And also, the idea was so that Yemen, the Romans could then attack from Yemen and attack areas of Parthia or do raiding and so forth. That never happened though, because the Roman invasion of Yemen was unsuccessful. However, the Romans continued to be involved in Yemen and in that area, and eventually the Romans and later the Byzantines, at least for a while, had an alliance with Yemen and in that area. The Romans called the southern area of the Arabian Peninsula Arabia Felix. And so obviously all this was going on, and the Parthians and later the Sassanids also had client states or little kingdoms that were allied with them, or would provide mercenaries or give them soldiers or armies to take part in their campaigns. And so some of those kingdoms were the Kingdom of Media, the Lakhmid Kingdom, and also some of the other areas that they later got involved into and moved into, which today is in the area of Oman and the United Arab Emirates, and in that area. And so both sides were hugely involved in throughout that region. Both sides made alliances, which worked both ways and went back and forth. For example, Palmyra, one of the Roman client kingdoms, rebelled and tried to take over, but eventually that failed. And sometimes it didn't always work out that way, but eventually the Kingdom of Armenia was later invaded and taken over by the Sassanid Empire, and they took that over Armenia. And even the down in Yemen, the Parthians invaded and later on took over that region. Even with all the various client states and various countries and kingdoms that the Romans and Parthians were involved in, even with all that, it still oftentimes wasn't enough. And so what the Romans would do is, instead of just having, for example, an alliance or having Armenia as a client state, they would, especially with the Parthians and the Sassanids, the Romans and later the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantines, they would pay tribute to the Parthians or the Sassanids at times. And one of the main reasons is because during the fighting it would be very expensive to have all the armies and all the supplies and so forth. It'd be very expensive to do that. Neither superpower was able to defeat each other, although both sides did make at least temporary territorial gains against the other. For example, the Sassanids were able to take over most of Turkey, Syria, and Egypt at one point, and the Romans were able to take Ctesiphon, which was the Parthian, or at least one of the Parthian and Sassanid capitals. They took that city several times and other areas. But the Romans were never able to keep the land or the territory they acquired. And so also during the fighting, it would cause a large amount of destruction to villages, cities, and so forth that various armies would sack or destroy. And so while the armies from the two superpowers and all their client states were going back and forth across the land, much of the countryside, the farms, would either be destroyed or plundered. And so even after the conflict ended, it would take sometimes it would take a long time, or really many years or decades to rebuild. And so what the Romans would do sometimes, or many times, they would pay tribute to the Parthians and later the Sassanids. For example, this is just an example, but to have a peace treaty, for example, the Romans would pay the Parthians, or later the Sassanids, 10 million denarii a year. And you say, well, why would they do that? Well, if it costs 30 million denarii or 40 million denarii a year, if there's a war, it would be cheaper to pay 10 million denarii for peace. And so that's oftentimes what they would do. Oftentimes, even when the Romans or the Parthians did have a client state, such as Armenia, the Armenians would try to stay neutral or try to stay out of the conflict. They didn't want to get involved. And so sometimes even the Romans or the Parthians themselves would not want to fight over Armenia. And so what the Romans or the Parthians and the Sassanids would do is sometimes, for example, the Parthians would pick a king who would be the next king in Armenia, but the Romans would have somewhat of a say in the matter, or they would have to approve. And so sometimes Armenia would be a neutral ground, or both sides would try to share Armenia. And that's one of the main reasons why Armenia was important to the Romans.